Today, Buffalo Trace quietly produces finely crafted bourbon. Yet more than 200 years ago on this very site, legends such as Daniel Boone and George Rogers Clark braved frontier dangers to find new lands and new adventures. In 1775, brothers Hancock and Willis Lee established the settlement of Leestown with a small company of men. Leestown was the Commonwealth's first settlement north of the Kentucky River, and the Lees group struggled to survive in a wilderness that was as rugged as their souls. In 1776, Indian raids coupled with the advent of the American Revolution nearly extinguished the settlement forever. But the Buffalo Trace continued to bring more pioneers westward. By 1789, the ancient Buffalo Crossing was bustling with activity as Leestown became a key stop along the Buffalo Trace and the Kentucky River. A brisk traffic in distilled spirits had begun, and Leestown's warehouses stored many a barrel of Kentucky whiskey. Soon, a distillery was built on the site, thus marking the beginning of what would become Buffalo Trace's long history as a pioneering and innovative leader in the bourbon industry. The first modern distillery was built here in 1857. It was the first U.S. distillery to incorporate the use of steam power, a major advance in producing high-quality whiskey. The distillery later was purchased and further modernized by E.H. Taylor, Jr., known as one of Kentucky's original bourbon aristocrats. Taylor was an industry leader who greatly advanced the quality of Kentucky's bourbon and safeguarded the bourbon label from bogus producers. By 1886, the distillery had introduced the nation's first climate-controlled warehousing for aging whiskey and was known around the world for producing America's finest spirits. The distillery remained a top producer well into the 1900s, but was threatened when Prohibition was enacted in 1920. Fortunately, it was one of the 4 distilleries in the United States to continue distillation during Prohibition. With a government permit, the distillery was allowed to produce limited bottlings of whiskey for medicinal purposes, helping to keep its doors open until repeal in 1933. Despite the setbacks of Prohibition and the Great Flood of 1937, the distillery rebounded and flourished under the guidance of Colonel Albert Blanton. Blanton was a bourbon aristocrat in the mold of E.H. Taylor and the great whiskey men of the 1800s. Blanton, born and raised on a farm adjacent to the distillery, was a bourbon traditionalist at heart. For himself and a few select friends, he occasionally produced and bottled a single-barrel bourbon, much the same way as Kentucky's earliest bourbon pioneers. In 1984, in honor of the Colonel and his love for tradition, the distillery made history with the world's first single-barrel bourbon to be marketed commercially.